Oh, okay. So thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Emily, and thank you to our attendees, and welcome to the webinar that's going to be about where you stand, know where you stand in the age of COVID. Michelle and I are both from Ontario Justice Education Network. We're a nonprofit that provides all kinds of education, both education supporting classrooms as well as outreach within communities around justice with the focus on youth. And Emily works for the Justice for Children and Youth, and she's a lawyer. She's also an educator, and she's going to be taking the lead today on what it is our topic is, which is where you stand in the age of COVID. And with that, before we continue, if you have any questions at all, please make sure that you direct your questions through the Q&A. Michelle will be taking care of our questions and posting them to Emily, and we'll make sure that we provide you with timely content. And we hope you enjoyed today's session. Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. Just a little addition. So we are a Legal Aid Ontario community clinic. That's our primary source of funding. There's 6 lawyers in our office, and we are also a registered charity. So we provide the range of advice as well as representation, this type of work, and in multiple areas of law. So I encourage you to visit the website if you have other questions about other areas of law, because today's focus is going to be specifically around the emergency measures and what we call the use of public space and around policing. So that's our focus today. There's a lot of other content available on our website otherwise. So for a quick outline of what I'm going to try and cover today is we're going to start with talking about the regulations and the bylaws. So we have a provincial regulation as well as a City of Toronto bylaw. And so our focus is also on the City of Toronto. And we'll go through that. Next, I'll talk about the different enforcement procedures that are happening, as well as the penalties that can exist. They're wide ranging, and there's some discretion for the bylaw officers and the police officers, so we'll talk about that. There are many people coming forward saying that they're inappropriately being given tickets, so we will cover how to address tickets themselves, what your options are, and how to dispute tickets. And then at the end, we'll point you to our resources that we've gathered, as well as we've saved quite a bit of time for Q&A. And so Michelle's going to be monitoring all of those. So if you have any questions, again, send them to Michelle, and she's going to monitor it throughout for all of us. I think if there's something pressing that comes up and what I'm saying is unclear, she'll flag it for us. But otherwise, to make this kind of a smooth webinar and not glitch back and forth for some of you, we're going to try and just have me speak for most of the next 40-45 minutes. Okay. Starting out, so we'll start with the regulations. So there's the Ontario Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. That's the name of the legislation that commenced on March 17th. And that is the focus of where we're at. That act itself covers a wide range of different areas of laws in terms of, you know, what businesses can be open, what's curbside, what's not curbside, etc. I'm only focusing on the very specific pieces that talk about public space. So it's what can we do and what can we do in that. And just in case no one's heard, that the act itself, the emergency period of time, has been just extended again by the Premier, and so it's extended till June 2nd. And so there's a limitation on how long they can put in emergency measures for, and they can renew it, but they can't just simply declare it between now and Christmas or something like that. There's a limit, so that's why these extensions are happening that way. And they also don't want to have it in place longer than absolutely necessary. So first of all, so the Ontario regulation applies to all of Ontario. So it's the same wherever you go in Ontario, and that's very important to remember because the Toronto bylaws are additional requirements within Toronto. But in all of Ontario, anywhere you're traveling, any young person who's coming to you with some questions, all of this applies. So there's two separate things that are prohibited. The first is you can't gather in a group of more than 5 people, except members of a single household. So some people are living in larger households with more people, and they can be gathered together in public. Otherwise, if it's a meetup, there has to be not more than 5 of them in the same household. The second piece that's prohibited is that you can't enter or use outdoor recreational amenities. That's the language in the Act. What this includes is public and private space, and that's really important because private space can include library, like outdoor parts of libraries, community centers, condos, apartment buildings. It also includes basketball courts and off-leash dog parks. So while the language says entering or using outdoor recreational amenities in the Act itself, it does allow you to go through some of these spaces. So you're allowed to go through some of the parks and recreational areas that are not otherwise closed. So that's mostly big parks, ravines, that you're allowed to go through. I think most recently we had that closure of High Park because of the cherry blossoms, and so they said that whole park is closed and you're not allowed to walk through it. It's now open again and you can walk through it. So things that are not otherwise closed, you can continue to go through.
Emily, sorry, can I jump in for 1 second here? I am understanding from some people in chat that they're not seeing the slides advancing, even though I think they are advancing for some people. So I'm just gonna make a slight modification to the screen share. If you just give me about 10 seconds to adjust what we're doing here. Sorry about this, everyone. Are you now seeing the screen saying focused on 2 sets of regulations?
I'm now seeing it actually. I wasn't seeing that before either.
Okay, folks are saying that it seems to be working now, so I'll just leave it like this, even though we're not quite in the correct slideshow view, but hopefully that's good enough. Okay, thanks.
And we are going to make the slide deck available to you as well, so you know, so you don't have to be frantically trying to screen capture or anything. We are going to make this available to you.
Yeah, we've had a question about that as well. So we will make the handout, the PowerPoint, and a video recording of this available to everyone after the fact.
Right, and we're going to post it both on the OJEN site and youth site. So it's good. We're trying to make it widely available to everybody, especially if you want to replay it or forward it to anyone else, or young people come to you with questions and they might want to see parts of it. So we're going to do that. Okay, so I was just talking about the Ontario regulations and what it includes and doesn't include. So no gatherings of more than 5 people and no use of outdoor recreational amenities. So the other thing about what amenities means is it includes things like exercise equipment. So outdoor pull-up bars. There's been a lawyer recently who's been quite public saying that they were on a run, they used one of these outdoor bars and they got a ticket. So, you know, it's unfortunate that people are getting tickets without being warned first, but it is happening. So we're trying to get the message out of what this includes. So and I mean, what they're focusing on is things that you can touch. And so it's about the spread of COVID itself that they're trying to prevent. So if you imagine the outdoor exercise equipment, having lots of people use it is the spread that they're concerned about. So the other thing are picnic sites and structures, because those are things that you would be touching. Skateboard and BMX parks as well are included, and public washrooms. All the public washrooms near all of these parks have been closed. So those are the types of things that are included in amenities.
Emily, I have one clarifying question here from the Q&A. Does it mean that if more than one household is living together, they can go out together? So for example, 2 households of 5 or 6 people each that were living together, what would be the rules for them if they were going outside?
And so that's a good question, because that's one of the things that are a bit vague. So in our arguments, we might say that if you're sharing, you know, 2 households or a whole bunch of roommates and you're all living in the same apartment, you're sharing a kitchen, you're sharing a bathroom, that's one household to us, right? You're all living together. If you look at your, if you have driver's licenses, you would all have the same address and the same apartment building. Where you would not be a single household would be if you are in a multiplex, like a house that's been divided into 3 units, 3 distinct separate units, then I would say that each unit itself is a household. Okay, I mean, and that's what we're saying, and that's what we would argue, but because the language is a bit vague and we haven't had an opportunity to test any of this in court, we're not sure what's going to happen with some of those, and I will go into that a bit further as well. Okay. So next I'm going to turn to the other set of regulations, which is the bylaw, the Toronto bylaw. So the City of Toronto bylaw, the actual number is 322/2020. They're calling it the physical distancing regulation. And this was enacted because in the city, there was concerns about people doing all of those other things and not physically distancing of 2 meters, 6 feet. And so that distance is, some people, it's like, what is 6 feet? I try to say, well, I'm about 5 foot tall, and so it's me lying sideways plus another bunch, right? It's kind of hard and it's a bit vague for someone out in public. You're not going to carry a metric system with you and a ruler and saying, hey, you have to be exactly, you know, move over, you're 2 inches too close. So that's also a bit of a challenge I think people are finding, but they have put it in several municipalities. So that's what, again, you have to know where you are and who's requiring what. And I think Brampton and Hamilton have something, and I think maybe Mississauga. So it is really important for people who are traveling to know what's required. And so in Toronto, it applies in the City of Toronto, obviously. And the 2 other parts is it's about regulating parks and squares. So it's not everywhere. So there's a limit to what this applies to. So parks includes ravines and parkettes. And squares are in the name. So Mel Lastman Square in North York, Nathan Phillips Square in downtown. So that's where those apply. And what does it prohibit? We talked about the 2 meters already, but on top of that, they reiterate the member of the same household requirement. And they use the language of no longer than an incidental period. And that's vague, and we'll talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But that's the walking through. That's why they say you can walk through the ravines, you can walk through the parkettes, as long as they're open, you're allowed to walk through them. They also included the same language around amenities. So they added, you know, no playgrounds, no equipment, no sports fields, washrooms. We put a link in there to see all there's a full list, it's quite long. And include the dog parks, which I didn't list there. So there's a number of things. So there is big overlap between the provincial regulations, and the biggest difference, the only significant difference, is around giving tickets for not maintaining the physical distancing, which the Ontario regulations don't provide for. Okay. What this does not include, that's important, it does not include sidewalks, parking lots, other paved spaces outside of buildings like the libraries, community centers. We'd say that if that happens, we would say you can challenge those tickets. In advance, we also received a ticket around what about other park rules? What if you walk through a park at night? And all regular rules to parks continue to apply. And one rule that many people don't know about is that all parks, parkettes, ravines, they're actually closed and off limits between midnight and 5:30 a.m. That's what the law has always been. It's not always widely enforced, but I think the question that came in advance was, what can we walk through a park at night? And so the law has always said you cannot do it between midnight and 5:30 a.m. Whether or not you get a ticket or a warning or someone's actually there policing the situation is another question, but the law says you cannot do those things. The law also says in parks on a regular basis is no drinking, no camping, no sleeping, no dwelling, and those rules have always existed, and the tickets for those are $100 upwards. So that's the starting point for those tickets. So we've moved on to, I want to go into a few more details just to make sure we all understand what I'm talking about. So benches. Benches has been a bit of an uproar in Toronto. People were really upset that they weren't allowed to use them. And so since the enactment of the physical distance regulation, a bunch of people received tickets for sitting on a bench. And because of the upset and the outrage and people sending notices in, they have changed that. So on April 24th, they said, we're not going to give any more tickets for using a bench, but they are warning people that we're not sanitizing these benches. If someone with COVID has been sitting on it, then it's still live, and it's still live, it's there. You need to be aware of that. But we're not going to give tickets anymore. And the law, before they said we're not going to give tickets anymore, said you can only use it for temporary respite. And that was a bit, well, what does that mean? So we heard a lot of people were being given warnings if they were using it, saying you're allowed, obviously if you're out for a walk and you're tired, they're saying you can use it to rest, but move on. So there is actively bylaw officers and police officers saying, please move on. So then that brings us to the next part, hanging out in a park. So this to us is a gray area because the city's message was don't do it. You're allowed to go for a walk, but don't hang out in a park. And people were being given tickets. So what if you just sit on the grass, right? So we say that's a gray area. And very recently, they have said, okay, it's getting warm. People need to go out. They're trapped in their homes, and some people have very small homes with a lot of people. They said that, you can go out, you can go to the park, you can use the park, you can sit on the grass, but you still have to maintain the physical distancing requirements. And the group, again, still has to be under 5 people from the same household. There is a big push to change that and change the numbers to increase the group size. It has not happened yet. It may happen tomorrow. It may happen next week. So it's really important to keep up on the news. We're trying to update our website as often as possible on our COVID page. As these things change, we're changing it on our website too. But that's the current status. Families, we already talked about, the household question. The other one that has come up for us is, what about shelters? Shelters have a lot of people in them. So does that count as household? So there are things that are part of these gray areas that we're concerned about. People are getting tickets. So we're gonna have to see what we can do about those. And that brings us to the next part around the youth experiencing homelessness. We work with young people in those situations. And the police have actively come forward and said, we're exercising some consideration. We're trying to, there are obvious reasons that the homeless population is afraid to be in the shelter system right now, especially with all the outbreaks. Another youth shelter just yesterday had another outbreak, and they've had to move a bunch of youth to a hotel. And so that's happening. So the idea is, if there are people who are homeless, who are precariously living household to household, the police are trying to, instead of ticket them, try to redirect and provide them with resources in terms of here's a shelter nearby, here's somewhere you can go, etc. So that's supposed to be happening, and it is happening. It's just we're also seeing that there are still tickets also being given. So both are happening. The next was the clarification on running, walking, and riding bikes. Absolutely, it's allowed as long as the place is not closed. So the park is not closed, the square is not closed. You're allowed to do all of those things, but there's also the physical distancing requirement. and the groups of 5 people. And the additional part is all dogs must be on a leash. So all those off-leash dog parks currently are closed. There's some indication that actually might change today, but we don't know that for sure. So right now, dog parks are closed, all dogs must be on leash. So the city message is, yes, okay to get some fresh air. Yes, okay to get some exercise, but again, keep moving on. And that is happening. So that's the current situation. I don't know if there's any questions that have come in, Michelle. If not, I'm going to move on to the enforcement piece. And what we've received quite a number of questions about around the rules of engagement and who's allowed to do what. So we want young people to understand the laws and to be able to be given accurate information. We believe that obviously there is a need for a community response to prevent the spread of COVID-19, but ideally it would be preferable to avoid negative interactions or any interactions that might lead to a ticket, because the fines are really steep. And those are really important to us in our office. We serve a lot of families from young people who are from low-income families and homeless youth, and these tickets for the average family who may not be working right now, they're steep. We're talking about the Toronto bylaw of tickets of $750 or $1,000. The provincial offense is you can also receive a ticket from $750 up to $100,000 or 1 year imprisonment. Our assumption is no one's going to be given a ticket from the very beginning for $100,000, but if you keep getting the tickets, they may start going higher and higher. And also these are offenses that can be given, these fine amounts are not just for what I'm talking about. Today, I said that this act, the provincial regulation covers more than just public space use. It covers businesses and what they're allowed to do. So some of these heftier fines are not being given to individuals for the public space situations. They're being given to businesses for other infractions. The other one is if the police wants to give you a summons to attend court instead because they think your infraction is quite serious, they're going to give you something that says you have to come to court. But right now courts are closed. So all the provincial offenses courts are closed except, and the criminal courts are all closed except for very urgent. So the criminal courts are dealing with urgent matters, but provincial offenses is shut down. And so what the police may not be telling people when they hand over this ticket is there's nothing you can do. There's some things, I'll talk about it next, but you can call in, you can ask, but you actually can't show up in court. You can't ask for discussion. You can't fight the ticket until the courts reopen. So right now you're limited in that respect, but the ticket itself says you have to respond within 15 days. And that's not true. As long as the emergency measures are in place, you don't have to respond within 15 days. You'll have to respond within 15 days once the courts open, or unless they pass something different. But right now, as it stands, the way we read the law is once the courts open, you have 15 days. Okay. In either case, whether it's a bylaw, infraction, or so you give their charges that are related. So the more common ones that we hear when there's negative encounters with police or where they police instruction of police officers charges are assaults. That's common too that we hear about. So what's happening? There's a large volume of police activity as well as bylaw officers. We have 160 police officers in the city of Toronto, and 200 City of Toronto bylaw officers actively patrolling to enforce the provincial and at the beginning, police officers were doing a lot of warnings for quite some time. So the first week or first weekend, I think the weather was quite nice. They were telling people to move along. They were explaining the legislation. They were explaining why and getting people to move along. But as the spread was continuing and as more and more people were getting out there, the city the officers were being directed to be using less discretion, give out more tickets. We need people to stop. So then the ticket numbers started to increase. And they've also started a call-in line, 311, right? So if you want to report someone who's violating the rules and the laws, then there's a 311 number that people are calling into, and they are receiving a lot of calls. The other significant departure from the law is the requirement for identification if they think you've committed an offense under the emergency measures, either the Toronto bylaw or the provincial ones. So any officer who has reasonable and probable grounds to suspect that a person has committed an offense under the emergency measures can demand the person's name, date of birth, and address. You don't necessarily have to have identification. So you don't have to have the official, your driver's license. But providing fake information or fake ID can lead to a charge of obstruction. And something I might be concerned about is, what if someone's recently moved? Obviously, their identification might not have the right address on it. What if you're with your roommate and you get a ticket? So those are the kinds of things we're concerned about. The other thing we're concerned about is this reintroducing carding practices, but under a whole different set of rules and regulations? And is this actually happening? Because the street carding itself had stopped. Carding was replaced by streets checks legislation, and there are rules, and those rules for street checks were specifically put in to address the carding issues. So I'm going to talk now about the difference between street checks and emergency measures, because I think this is quite significant to think about. And obviously, it's hard in the moment to pull all these things back into your mind, but one of the key messages for youth is, if they think you've broken the laws around physical distancing and households, they can ask you who you are. And you are required in law to give your name, date of birth, and address, which is very different than before. Before you had the right to remain silent due to charge you, but under the emergency measures, they can absolutely ask you for this information. And so the big difference is it's not voluntary. You can't refuse. The penalty for not providing this information is steep. It's a $750 ticket for not telling them who you are, as well as an option for them to charge you with obstruction for justice, which then would be a criminal charge. Street checks, on the other hand, are different because the individual gets to choose whether or not to talk to the police officer. They can say, I don't want to talk to the police officer, and there's no punishment. You get to leave. Street checks were also designed to protect people from discrimination based on age or race or gender, or even the neighborhood that you happen to be in or live in. And so street checks were really limited. They could only be performed in the course of inquiring into offense that may have been committed, suspicious activity, or gathering information. And under the emergency measures, the other part of it is, when they do take this ID and this information, it's not supposed to be a street check. They're not supposed to keep the information, because under a street check, they can keep all of the information and they can use it and as part of their data on street checks. And in a street check, if they are keeping that information and they're writing it down, you get a receipt. You get to be told that this has happened to you. But under the emergency measures provisions, they've demanded your ID, not a street check, and they're not supposed to be keeping all that data in the same way as the street checks data bank. I think, Mark, you had raised a question. Okay, I'm seeing it now. We're good. So I've covered it. So it's really important to know the differences. And the key difference is emergency measures is new. It's all around COVID-19 spread, and that's when they can ask for the ID. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which is talking to you. We had addressed this, we had created this and designed it for frontline staff who are working with young people and so we want to cover, like, how can you help? What can you do? I already talked about, giving information is really important. Explaining what COVID-19 might be and how it's spread, which I would pull from, the health, the City of Toronto health pages. To explain some of that or give them information. The big one is proof of an address. So if you're working with a young person who has no identification, maybe you can give them something written that says this is where they're living right now, especially if it's from a shelter. If they're living in a shelter, that would be really useful. They maybe have had to leave home for whatever reason, they kicked out, being abused, unsafe, this is occurring and coming up because youth are not going to school, they're not going to community centers, they're not going to the after-school library programs, they're at home. And they're leaving home and going out into public space because it's safer for them. So something from you showing that that's their address, they've changed their address, might be useful if they do get stopped. Talked about explain what is and isn't allowed. So those are the things I just covered right now around, what's an amenity, what's a park, what's a square.
Emily, can I jump in with a question? Jacqueline would like to know what happens for young people who are experiencing chronic or intermittent homelessness, who have trouble hanging on to things like ID or even letters from shelters. What would you recommend frontline workers to do? Like, should they ask you to call them? Like, what's the path there?
Yeah, absolutely. If you have a cell phone that they can call you on and you're open to doing that, that would be fantastic. Like, anything that you can do to help explain the person's circumstances to an officer is really important. And you're right, maybe they can't hang on to those letters. The other one would be, be prepared to keep writing the letters. They may come to you every day and ask you for another doing that. So that's another way to help out. So I'm going to move on to the next part. I hope that answers the question. If not, please let me know. And then also, where necessary, strategize around avoiding police contact. And avoiding, to us, it's about avoiding situations that could cause police contact. So around the groups of 5 people. If you are in a group of other youth from the same shelter and there's 12 of you, maybe you need to split up, right? So maybe that's something to talk about, because that's something you need to consider. And one strategy would be, obviously it's way more fun to be in the larger group, but because of the current situation, maybe you do want to split up so you're in less than 5, and then that might decrease your risk of the police coming to you or the bylaw officers coming to you. So that's one way. And then the next part is correlated, is preparing for that contact. What are the safety strategies? How to avoid a ticket by being, explaining. So, like, for example, we are living together, we are roommates, like being really straightforward and maybe saying things that they don't necessarily have to have said before in the law, when you could have the right to remain silent. You didn't have to explain yourself in the same way, but now when you're in these situations, you might have to explain them in the same way, in a different way. And this is purely to avoid that ticket, to avoid a negative interaction, to avoid things escalating to where it may become physical. and avoid other charges. And then the last one is around gathering evidence, is if they're given tickets, they need to record things. Who were they with? What happened? Well, like, so if they are in the parking lot, count that right, and people in that situation. If the is and there's a fraction, you're a burden for every group to all do the same thing. You end up with tiny differences. Ultimately, what you want to do is write down a description as well. Change the memory spell. So ideal to write things down as soon as possible. If you have the badge number, then that can be written down. And I'm getting a message that maybe things are breaking up. So maybe can we hear in the chat group if everyone's able to follow along, or is it breaking up for you as well?
Emily, I'll let you know as answers come in. I missed a tiny bit of your details about how to record the who, what, where, when. But other people seem to be saying that you're good. So yep, everyone else is so far is saying that you're fine. So I'd say go ahead and move on. And if anyone else missed part of that, let me know and I'll make sure that we get to recap it.
Okay, and what we'll do is we're gonna review the video. And if there's things in the video that are bad, we'll re-record them and put them back in there. But just a quick recap on the evidence is you want to write down as much details as possible so you have that information available to you for future challenges. Okay, I'll move to that, challenging a ticket. So again, the courts are closed. It has to be urgent or otherwise they're not open. So anyone who's supposed to show up in court for a criminal charge, they can't do it. It's not an option. Right now, they keep changing the dates, obviously, as information comes in. Right now, the courts are saying that they're going to be closed till July 3rd and will be open July 6th at the earliest. So we have a COVID courts page. I'm updating that regularly. So there's some information there as well. So everyone's just has to keep paying attention. So for the Provincial Offenses Court, absolutely, they're closed. They're not considering these essential. So when they reopen, plead guilty, and lots of people aren't going to be able to pay these or shouldn't be paying them if it's a choice between rent and food versus the fine. So in that situation, there's 2 and 3. So you can plead not guilty and go to a trial. And at that trial, one of the options is to explain why the fines are too steep and ask for a reduction. The third one is ask for an early resolution meeting with a prosecutor. So right now, if you get the ticket, you can put in that request online or by mail. And once you put in that request, you wait. Once the courts are reopened, you will be sent a notification telling you when your meeting resolution, your early resolution meeting date is and the location of it. If at the end of that meeting there is no resolution, then a trial date will be set. Okay, so again, for both of those, 2 and 3, it gives the young person a chance to tell their story about what happened. It also gives the opportunity to ask for a lower fine, even if they are found guilty. What defenses are going to count and what is going to give you some leeway is things like, what if it was a necessity? It was necessary that you were doing what you were doing. You know, running through the park was the shortest distance to home and it was, you know, late at night. is that necessity? Depends. What if it was unintentional? You didn't mean to, you didn't know. Will any of those be defenses? In general, they're not. In general, you're assumed to know the laws and you can be charged and be given tickets. But under these emergency measures, we're not sure whether or not there might be more leeway that might occur in the back end. So we have to wait and see. We don't know, which is why avoiding the ticket and avoiding the stress and anxiety of having to address and deal with the ticket is ideal. Obviously, not everyone can do that, but that's our ideal situation. The more tickets that can be avoided, the better. And the last part I was going to cover was around remedies and complaints. And it's about what systems are available to seek some sort of redress if there is the negative interaction with an officer, or you believe the officer acted inappropriately. Officer, if you don't to appeal to Toronto on materials. So that's if the ticket was given by a Toronto bylaw officer. If it's being given by a police officer, the complaints would be to the Office of the Independent Police Review Directorate, OIPRD. There's loads of information on their website. The complaint form is on the website. We say to someone, if the complaint form seems really difficult, too hard, reach out. Frontline workers, if you can help a young person fill those out, that would be great. There is a 6-month limitation period normally for making those complaints. We don't know whether or not those are going to be extended because of the emergency measures. So it would be ideal to get in that complaint within the 6 months at this time, and to speak to a lawyer for advice if they want. They can call the local community clinic. For anyone under 18, they can call us. Anyone who's homeless and under 25, they can call us as well.
Emily, can I throw in one clarifying question?
Sure.
What's the easiest way to know whether you are talking to a bylaw officer or a police officer, or which of those paths to go after the fact?
Usually you can tell by what they're wearing. Their uniform, do they have a TPS, Toronto Police Service uniform? And you can ask. As well as on the ticket itself, it might identify that information. And if you're unsure, then make both complaints. That's not ideal, obviously, because it's more work. But if you were to call 311 and you say, this is my ticket, and this is what it says on it, et cetera, the City of Toronto will be able to tell you, right, whether or not they have it or not. The other one is colors. As Mark's pointing out, the officers are a little bit different. I worry that the young person may not recall because both are wearing blue, right? So light blue versus dark blue. Are they wearing a firearm or not wearing a firearm? You might not be focused on that detail at that moment, but those are little things that would help. The light blue, dark blue is the easiest one, I would say, than looking for a firearm. Because I think when you are engaging with a police officer, looking around is not ideal. Focusing on what's happening gives you kind of a better engagement, and they are trusting you more if you're looking at them. And so, and then Mark just wrote that the bylaw officers are more friendly. Just kidding. If anything, it's both. Some are more friendly, some are having a good day, some are having a bad day. But I think in this COVID situation, I think all of the officers have been trying to use a bit of their discretion to move people along, and that has happened. So the other aspect of it, so we have the differences of complaining about the officer specifically. If you think the situation is discriminatory and there was a racial profiling aspect of it, you can complain to the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario. There is also the Human Rights Legal Support Center. Their services are a little more limited, the Legal Support Center. They use a limited retainer basis, so they only help you step by step and don't commit to helping you throughout until they decide what happened at the step before means they should help you at the next step. And they don't generally assist with writing the initiating claim. So in those circumstances, you might want to call your community legal clinic if they're unable to assist. The last one is just quickly on advocacy efforts. The resources are in your handout, but the Canadian Civil Liberties Association and policingthepandemic.ca, they're also collecting data. CCLA is looking to whether or not they want to try and do a systemic advocacy to ask that all the tickets just go away, or some other form of tickets shouldn't be moved forward, or is there a group way to deal with them? And Policing the Pandemic is collecting data and has written a number of reports. So if you care about to see what's happening in the ticketing situation across Canada, that's what they're doing.
I've just dropped those links in chat in case anyone's looking.
Perfect. Thanks, Michelle. And the big thing to remember with CCLA, the Canadian Civil Liberties Association, and Policing the Pandemic, their goal is systemic advocacy and looking at what's happening. They're doing studies and reports. They do not offer individual representation and summary legal advice. So for those, you do have to go to either us, the community legal clinic, or a lawyer, and we have those resources given to you as well. So that's the end of my formal presentation, other than to say that, yes, we have resources. The link has been provided. You can see on the top of this page, on the top right-hand corner, it shows you where the handout is listed. And then we need to post both the webinar and our PowerPoint together. The other thing to know is our homeless youth lawyer, our street youth legal services lawyer, Claire, she also did a webinar for our street youth legal services project partners. And so there's another webinar that covers this in slightly different detail with a focus on the homeless youth population. And that's available on our website as well as the PowerPoint for that one. So these are all the resources we've made available for you, PowerPoint as well as this. And then on the, if you can flip to the questions page, Michelle, I've also created 2 separate infographics that were created for our homeless youth population shelters to post because not everyone has access to the internet. And so one's for Ontario and one's for Toronto because not everyone, not all of our project partners are in Toronto. So the whole difference around the physical distancing is different. So those are the 2 that are also available on our website for download. That's it. So that was my big spiel, and I hope you found it useful, and I'm glad you asked questions through that period of time. As well, Michelle has been taking any other questions through the Q&A, so I invite you to send those into her, and she can let us know what kinds of questions have come up and whether I need to address some of them.
Yeah, I have a couple here for you. So first of all, Neighbourhood Legal Services has also published a Know Your Rights pamphlet, which I put the link to their website in chat, and they're doing a ticket tracker as well. And I wanted to ask you, apart from the CCLA ticket tracking and policing the pandemic, do you know of any other sort of community organizing or community action avenues that people are pursuing right now to try to address this issue?
Those are the large scale ones that we know of. So I don't know for sure. And I'll ask, the Neighbourhood Legal Services is actually doing it in partnership with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. And I know they've received a total of about 100 people coming forward with their stories and information about their tickets. And I think about 13 of them are young people under 18. So that's the current situation. I'm going to assume that they're going to get more as time goes on and as more people become aware of these situations that are coming up. I think also in terms of resources, those 2 organizations, as well as Neighbourhood Legal Services, are well resourced and well positioned to take on a bigger scale legal challenge if it comes to that. So that's
Great.
what I would, those are the things we're focusing on those agents.
One other question that I thought was worth raising. What's the best way for people to find what their local community legal clinic is if they aren't specifically working with just a youth audience, where JFCY is sort of the best option?
Okay, so there's a link on the handout, and it's to the Legal Aid Ontario Community Legal Clinics page. And what happens is if you go to there, there's a they let you search by address or postal code, and that's the best way to find your community legal clinic.
Great.
Most of the legal clinics right now are all, in our situation, we're all working from home. So some, like our phones being redirected directly so you can get to a live person when you call, but other ones require you to leave a message. So just be aware that there are slight differences.
Great. We had another question come through about what other consequences should we be aware of the courts being closed right now? So you talked about how, you know, it doesn't say it on tickets. Tickets still say you have 15 days to respond to this, but really we're proceeding with the understanding that the counter doesn't start running until courts reopen. Is there anything else that we should be thinking about along those lines?
I think the ones that have come up with us a lot is around the criminal charges, so charges under the Youth Criminal Justice Act, as well as the criminal code for adults, is those courts are also closed except for emergencies. They are running some bail hearings, but otherwise, and they're also doing on consent, the bail variations. So they're doing those, but otherwise they've said, if you have a court date and it was between March 17th till now, don't go. You can't go. There's no reason to go. And so that's when I said the courts at the earliest are going to be opening July 6th. What they have not come up with is a good mechanism for, they can't have everyone who was supposed to attend court during that period of time all show up on July 6th. Right. So it's unclear how they're going to address that right now. I'm going to assume that they're going to come up with some guidelines, but that hasn't come out. So that's the biggest one. If they think it's urgent, then they should definitely be contacting a lawyer to try and determine whether or not it can be addressed on an urgent basis, because they are doing some limited things by phone and by video. But again, it's quite limited. And the other key one for us, because we're working with homeless youth and youth that are living in precarious situations, is they cannot be evicted from like a normal rental space. So there's some information in the other webinar around that as well, and some stuff on our website around evictions. Those are the big things that are coming up for us that we're seeing around the judicial system being shut down.
Okay. Along those same lines, is duty council still operating, or what should people expect in terms of duty council services?
A lot of the duty council services are being operated remotely as well. So while they exist, it doesn't mean you're necessarily going to see the person. Sorry, I'm switching because I'm getting a little noise in my apartment. So right now there is duty council available in limited circumstances. So it is always worth checking. If you think you need duty council, just seek it out, and they'll let you know whether or not it's available or not.
Great. What in your view are the best places, what's the best way for us to keep on top of changes? I mean, I think today is May 14th, if anyone is watching this at a later date. And even today, I know we're expecting to hear from the Premier about sort of next steps. Can you recommend how we all keep up with what the rules are?
Super hard. So I'd say right now the two main legal clinics that are actively trying to maintain their website as up to date as possible are the Neighbourhood Legal Services and ours. It's really hard. Otherwise you're talking about listening to the news, looking at the Government of Ontario website. Is the only other way to be keeping up to date. It is quite tricky. and even stuff on our website we may not get to like at that moment. So if something is announced at noon, or maybe something, I'm looking at my clock right now, what if something was announced at 10? I won't know until the end of this, and I won't be able to change the website until then. So it is a bit unfortunate, but I do think the news is doing quite a good job of trying to keep on top of it, and letting people know what the rules are.
Great. We've had another question come through. What about people traveling in a car? Like if people need to go out somewhere by car, but don't live together?
That I have told people in car together who have been tickets, but I was also told that, or we've been told that it's okay to travel in a car together. So I think those are going to be tickets that are going to be open to challenge in the future, because it is, you cannot maintain that 6-foot separation in a car. It's just not possible. So that's an unfortunate circumstance, but it is happening. And there are other people who are traveling in cars together as a group and not getting tickets when they're pulled over. So both are happening. And I want to point out that Mark just pointed out the other resource is, in terms of up-to-date information, is the Toronto Police Service, because they are sharing what they're being expected to do, as well as what the laws are changing. So I want to highlight that as well. Thanks, Mark. For some of you who don't know, Mark was a former police officer, and he's kind of our go-to around the TPS activity right now.
So we have, I just want to flag that it's 11:32, and so we've sort of hit the 1-hour mark of our webinar, and to be respectful of everyone's time, in case anyone needs to leave right at 11:30, we have a couple more questions that I'm happy to put to you if you can stick around for a few minutes, but in case we have people dropping off, I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you so much to Emily from JFCY for the great work you do and for being here to share all of this really useful information with us. As I've said, I am still taking questions through Q&A, and I think we're going to hang out for another maybe 15 minutes or so if anyone has further questions. But we also want to release you if you have work to get back to. So thanks so much.
Sorry, Michelle, if I just want to interrupt for a second. If there are things that you're interested in getting more information or another webinar in, please send that to Michelle as well, because we are open to hosting a different event to give you more information, maybe with different speakers based on the types of questions that you have. So we are open to doing that as well.
Yeah. The one other source of good legal information that I wanted to shout out is Steps to Justice, the site maintained by Community Legal Education Ontario, has a dedicated section that is all about special circumstances under COVID. So if you go there, if you go to stepstojustice.ca, you will see it, prominently sort of bannered on the front site. They have been working really hard to address COVID-specific questions in a lot of different areas, including landlord and tenant law, employment law, health and safety, all kinds of different areas. That is not youth specific. That is mostly assuming an over 18 audience. But I mention it just because it's another way to not have to just be sorting through news and trying to figure out what your rights are or what's changing.
Absolutely, and they translate everything into French. And the other one is they are, I think they put a little bit of bylaw stuff in, and we're going to help them boost up that information. So the community clinics are definitely banding together and trying to work together to ensure that Steps to Justice has as much information on it as possible.
So I have another question here for you, Emily. There are many young people who are out because they have unsafe living situations or they're dealing with severe mental health, but they won't share that information with police because they live in overpoliced neighborhoods and they have apprehensions about all sorts of stuff. And we wanted to know if you have any suggestions for how to support those young people.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think some of that was around talking to them about, if they're leaving the house, is there a safer place to be, to hang out, especially as the weather gets warmer? Is there somewhere that, a friend's backyard kind of thing where they're physically distancing, but they're safe and they would be out of the view of a bylaw officer or police officer? That kind of thing would be useful if they want to talk to someone and they want kind of access 24/7. There's always the kids' help phone. We've talked to a lot of young people around the situations around leaving home and what to do in those circumstances in terms, some have left home to be somewhere else and other people have taken them in. Some people have left home and they've gone to shelters, but we can provide some legal advice on that for those situations. It's really tricky. The other one would be to talk to them about whether or not they're, especially in the mental health context, whether there's a way that they could share without having to say it. So could something be written down? Could something be written down by you? You don't have to disclose everything, but something short to explain it a little bit that might help their situation.
Great. So we have one question that's come in about if you feel you were unfairly stopped by the police and fined $750 under the emergency measure laws, and you want to complain and fight this fine, am I right in thinking that the sort of complaints measures that we talked about earlier are the best way to do that?
Well, there's the challenging the tickets as well. You can do a direct challenge against the ticket that you received, and that was on page 14 of our PowerPoint. And that's going to be made available to you. And so that's probably the best way to address the ticket itself. The complaints mechanism is designed to be used if the interaction itself was negative or inappropriate, not the ticket. If you think the ticket is inappropriate, then you have to challenge it through the provincial offenses system.
Great. I did want to mention one more time also that we're recording this webinar, and we will be sending a set of the slides, the handout, and a link to the recording to everyone who attended or was registered afterwards. And all these materials will be hosted on both the OJEN site and the JFCY site. I'll say within a day or two. You might have to give us to Monday at the latest.
We're also going to review the recording to make sure that it's smooth.
So this is slightly tangential, but I'm sure it's something lots of people are wondering about. Can a landlord enter your apartment multiple times during the pandemic, and do they have to wear PPE when they do so? This is a little outside the scope, so if you are totally sure.
So we have there's a lot of information. There's information on our website and our Neighborhood Legal Services website, Steps to Justice. But just quickly, it depends on why they're entering. And they do have to give some notice, and obviously all those other rules around physical distancing, I would ask, you can ask for those to be enforced. I know some people who, had to move or had to go look at apartments, and they've been using the masks and hand sanitizer and wiping down and gloves. But what the laws are on all of those, I can't answer off the top of my head. I'd have to do a bit of digging. But there are requirements for sure that are still in place for a landlord to come in, and those haven't changed. And that's all on the Steps to Justice website around when a landlord can enter your premises. That has not changed.
And I just dropped the link to Steps to Justice in the chat. It also, of course, is on the handout that we've been directing you to. So hopefully that helps for the person who answered this question.
Mm-hmm. Steps to Justice is on our website as well as the second listed on the resource page. So it's a really good resource around the tenancy situation.
Okay, for the moment, I'm not seeing any further questions. So if anyone else has anything last minute, please feel free to write it in, or otherwise, you always can reach out to us, especially if you're a community worker who needs support in supporting the young people that you work with. Both OJEN and JFCY are here for you in that pursuit. Otherwise, thank you everyone so much for your time today. Thank you to our attendees for sticking with us and submitting such good questions. And thanks again to Emily for helping clarify so much. This was really useful for me. I learned a lot through this webinar. Okay, with that, I think we'll sign off. So everyone, please look for an email from us in the next couple of days with all the materials that we've promised. And stay safe and take care.
Thanks, everyone.